Hello and welcome to the Lancaster Patriot Podcast, brought to you by futureofchristendom.org. My name is Chris Hume. Thank you so much for joining me again, and happy Thanksgiving to you and your family. One of the best holidays. I love Thanksgiving. Reformation Day, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the best three holidays all in a row. So I'll have a few words to share about Thanksgiving, but first, a couple of brief announcements. Number one, if you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/The Lancaster Patriot. You'll get early access to every podcast and also bonus content, including our book club. We already have one episode released, and I know I've been behind, but Frankenstein is coming soon. Also, there's a town hall coming up December 10th here in Lancaster County. So if you're local and you listen to this podcast, I'd love to see you in Leola on December 10th at the Bearville Fire Department, where we will be discussing what's next for America. Trump won the election. What's next, though? What do we need to do as Christians to establish justice in our county, in our state, in our nation? I'll be speaking. Luke Saint will be speaking. Joel Saint will be speaking. Dave Stoltzfus will be speaking. Very brief speeches, but then we'll open it up to questions from the audience and some interaction. So I'm looking forward to that. We're hoping to do a lot of those events in the future. A grassroots approach, trying to get out there and interact with people who really want to see their communities changed, and I believe want to see justice established, but aren't sure how, because I believe the church has not been teaching what the Bible says about justice, what the Bible says about the civil realm, and that's what we're going to try to do and get this discussion going and declare the lordship of Christ in the public square, which I do want to talk about briefly today. But first, just a couple words on Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is one of my favorite holidays. Now, because probably for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons being I love that the historical period from basically the end of the 16th century, late 1500s, up until the mid 1650s to the end of the 1600s. And specifically, I really enjoy reading about the Pilgrims. And in fact, a few years ago, I started a podcast called Church History for Everyone. I only got 8 episodes, but I think you might be interested in those 8 episodes. It basically chronicles the life of William Bradford from when he was a boy all the way up, I think, until the point where he came over to America. A lot of people are familiar that William Bradford, he wasn't the first governor of Plymouth, but he became the long-standing governor. I believe John Carver was the first one. He died after maybe his first term, and William Bradford became the governor of Plymouth Plantation. So he's well known for his role in American history there. But there's a fascinating history of the Pilgrims prior to their arrival in America. They are basically harried out of England by King James, go to the Netherlands, and try to make a go of it there, and it doesn't work out. In fact, I want to read a couple things here from something I wrote a few years ago regarding that. So the Pilgrims are in the Netherlands, and there's 4 main reasons that they said we need to get out of the Netherlands and ultimately come to the New World, come to North America. They were actually debating between 2 places. I can't remember if it was in Africa or South America, but they were debating between one of these exotic places, if you will, and coming to America, and they ended up choosing America. I think they were actually trying to make it to Virginia. They ended up landing in what we call New England and established Plymouth Plantation. And fascinating story. One of my favorite books of all time is William Bradford's account of their life leading up to that, and then their journey to the New World, and then their life in America. It's called Of Plymouth Plantation. It's a nonfiction work. It's William Bradford's, it's basically his diary, and it's a fascinating read. There are parts of it that are a bit dry because he's dealing with the business context, and they had basically a contract with these people back in England. But overall, it is a fascinating read of these men and women who came to America basically with nothing but the scriptures and the worldview that was taught to them primarily by their pastor, John Robinson, who stayed behind in the Netherlands and England. I forget where that group finally ended up, but he stayed behind. He never made it to the New World, but he taught them how to be self-governed, how to apply the Bible to their life. And though they weren't perfect, just as we're not, they made some serious progress in terms of biblical justice. In fact, I believe that with the Pilgrims, you have the first case of a European, a white European, if you will, being tried and convicted for the murder of a Native American. And they were applying the biblical law. You shall have one law for the native and the sojourner, and they sought to be faithful to the scriptures and apply God's law across the board. That was their foundation. Did they do it perfectly? No, but that's where they were. That's what they were aiming for, and they are to be commended for that. So, but I think it's fascinating. I just want to share briefly something about that first celebration. So here you have these pilgrims in a pagan land. I mean, they come over in 1620. In the fall of 1621, they have this celebration where they celebrate God's provision, and they do it with nearly 100 pagans, if you will. Now, they're in the midst of a land full of pagans. And the Native Americans, there were some, of course, that were more friendly than others, but there were many of these tribes that were violent, cannibalistic. There was constant warfare between the tribes, just like there was in Europe between the different nations there. But it was a pagan land. Christianity was not planted yet. Christianity was brought mainly by the Pilgrims. Of course, there were others as well. But you have this initial celebration. The harvest celebration was an English tradition. But these European settlers, these Pilgrims, came over, and Chief Massasoit, who was the chief of the Wampanoag Indians that were in that area, those were the main Indians that the Pilgrims interacted with, he brought 90 of his warriors with him to have this party. And the Pilgrims only had about 50 because about half of them had died by the time they reached America. And then also there were several that died when they got here. There was more that died when they got here. So they set out with about 100. By the time they reached 1621, they're down to about half that number, 50 Pilgrims left. And here you have these Native Americans coming to their celebration, and the Pilgrims are vastly outnumbered, nearly 2-1, and yet they're celebrating God's provision. So here's an account. I think this might be from Mort's Relation, but this is Edward Winslow recounting the event of what I call the first Thanksgiving. Now, of course, I know the harvest celebration was an English tradition, but this is kind of what we look back to as the first Thanksgiving, even though this was probably not the end of November. But he says this: "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might, after a special manner, rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They, 4 in one day, killed as much fowl as with a little help beside, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and then went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." So that's Winslow recounting the first Thanksgiving, if you will. And these Pilgrims came to the New World. They didn't come here to plunder. They came here to raise their children in the fear of the Lord, to cultivate the land, to take dominion, and advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is why they came, and that, I would argue, is why they succeeded. Now, we've fallen far from our forebears here, but we need to get back to the foundation that they had. Again, they weren't perfect, but they did not come here to further the kingdom of man, but to further the kingdom of Christ. And William Bradford, in his book of Plymouth Plantation, he writes of the reasons why they came to America. So again, they were in the Netherlands, and they say, we need to get out of here. And here are the 4 reasons why the Pilgrims gave for traveling to the New World. Number 1, the church was unlikely to grow in Holland. Okay, they said, the church is not growing here. There were a lot of challenges, and I'll mention some of these in the other reasons, but they didn't know the language. They felt like they were not able to establish themselves as a people, as a community, as a culture, and multiply and grow. And so they needed to go somewhere where the church would grow and they would be able to multiply and bless those around them. Number 2, the people were being worn down by heavy labor in Holland, and such an experience would lead to their community diminishing or scattering. So kind of ties in with 1. They said, okay, we're not prospering here. We are farmers. That's what, they were used to farming. They were an agricultural people from England, coming from rural England, and they go to Holland, and it's very urban where they are, and they're working, I believe a lot of them are in the textile industry, and their people are being worn down. They're getting sick. They're saying, we're not prospering here. We're not doing well, and we need to be able to succeed and be successful to take dominion and further the kingdom of Christ. So that was the second reason. Number 3, and this is a very important one for them, they were concerned that their children were being drawn away into worldliness. Now, the Netherlands, there was a lot of Reformation happening there, but by the time the Pilgrims got there, there was also a lot of pluralism, if you will. And they were concerned that their children were being influenced. One, they would lose the English language, they would lose the influence of their parents' culture, and they would end up becoming assimilated into the Dutch culture, which at the time, I think the perception from the Pilgrims was, this is not a good culture, this is a worldly culture, at least those that were around them. So they wanted to protect their children in a godly culture, and they didn't think they could do that in the Netherlands. So they needed to emigrate, they needed to move, they needed to go somewhere else. And finally, the fourth reason was that they desired to spread the gospel of the kingdom of Christ. Now, I think all those reasons relate to that. And something that we talk about often, it's touched on in Luke's book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy, and I'll also have an announcement here about a new book coming out from Future of Christendom. But the idea of dominion, this is man's purpose. So when the Pilgrims are coming to America, yes, they're concerned about their ability to provide for their families, their ability to raise up their children. All those things are related to their desire to spread the gospel of the kingdom of Christ. Because when we take dominion, when we are successful and serve neighbor and have products to sell to our neighbors or services to provide for our neighbors, and we're able to raise up our children and teach them and see them grow in the discipline and knowledge of the Lord, that is spreading the gospel. That is taking dominion. So the Pilgrims came over here with their wives and children to advance the kingdom of Christ. Now, commenting on that point that they wanted to spread the gospel, Bradford wrote this. He said, lastly, this is where he's going through the reasons why they needed to leave the Netherlands. Lastly, and which was not least, a great hope and inward zeal they had of laying some good foundation, or at least to make some way hereunto, for the propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in those remote parts of the world, yea, though they should be but even as stepping stones unto others for the performing of so great a work. So that's Bradford's perspective on it. It's a very important perspective. He said, look, if we can simply be stepping stones for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to do this work, what's the work? The advance of the kingdom of Christ, propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ. If we can just be stepping stones, if we can be faithful in our lives and be stepping stones for those after us, then we will have been successful. And my encouragement to you, listener, is that we find ourselves as Christians, again, basically in the midst of a pagan land in many ways. Obviously, it'll never be the same as it was in 1620. 400 years from now, it won't be exact same as it is now. But in many ways, we find ourselves in a land that is rejecting the lordship of Christ. And the concern for many of us is that many Christians are still kind of buying that mentality that the lordship of Christ is not to be declared in the public realm. The Pilgrims did not believe that. They believed that everything they did was to advance and propagate the kingdom of Christ. That was why they existed. And so every decision they made was to further that end, to take dominion and advance the gospel. And in many ways, we find ourselves in a similar position, though it's very different. Of course, they came here, the land was barren. I mean, their task, it was daunting. And we might think today, well, how could we ever get to a place where we have biblical law and justice in our land? Well, the Pilgrims come to America. I mean, could they I don't know if they could have imagined that we would be here today experiencing the blessings from those men and women 400 years later. So we can't get caught up on, well, where is this going to end? Bradford said, look, if we can just be stepping stones, if we can be faithful to follow God's law and advance the gospel, then maybe the next generation will take this even further. But we're not going to compromise. We're going to do all we can to be faithful to the Lord. And again, I mentioned their desire for justice. If you find another case, let me know. But I think this is the first case, and I believe this is recorded in his book of Plymouth Plantation, of an Englishman being tried, found guilty, and executed for the murder of an Indian. Again, Numbers 15:16, one law and one manner shall be for you, and for the stranger that sojourneth with you. Biblical justice. A great example of that among the Pilgrims. And they had peace with the native. That first generation, peace. Peace with the natives, peace with Massasoit and his men. Very fascinating history. And then it kind of spiraled out of control in the next generation. And why that happened is a discussion for another time. But we find ourselves here celebrating Thanksgiving. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving with your family. It's a wonderful holiday. And may we give thanks to the Lord. It's something that a pagan culture cannot understand, but it's something that Christians should really celebrate and be very outspoken about, that we are giving thanks to the Lord Jesus Christ for every blessing that we have. But we are in a challenging time. We're in a pagan land in a sense. And remember that our task, just like the task of the Pilgrims, is to be fruitful and multiply and take dominion and be faithful to Christ and apply his law so that we might be even stepping stones unto others for the performing of so great a work. We have to have that vision. I believe we need the Pilgrims' vision, that we can't be just focused on our lifetime. We can't be focused on, well, what can we do to just kind of get by, to make things not so bad for us. We have to have a longer view, a long-term view, and the establishing of Christ's kingdom must be paramount, not the establishing of man's kingdom. So be thankful this year for Christian families. Protect the family, grow your family, and those are the things. They've overcome paganism before, and they can do so again. So that's my Thanksgiving encouragement to you. If you have not read Bradford's book of Plymouth Plantation, I think it's really should be required reading for any student of American history. Fascinating work. So I encourage you to check out William Bradford's book of Plymouth Plantation. I think you'll find it very enjoyable, and I hope you have a very happy Thanksgiving with you and yours this year. Well, I want to transition now to Christ in the public square in our day, in 2024. There are challenges that we face that, of course, were different than the Pilgrims back in the 1600s. And how do we honor Christ in the public realm? How do we establish justice? And I'm joined now on the line by my good friend Luke Saint, who is the author of the Sound Doctrine of Theocracy and the host of the Think and Reform podcast. Luke, thank you for joining me today, and I want you to talk a little bit about what you told me the other day regarding Christ in the public square and the temptation that Christians have now that we are basically experiencing what some are calling a golden age with the election of Trump. Are we tapping the brakes when it comes to demanding justice and calling for Christ to be honored in the public square?
Well, this is ultimately your observation, Chris, that you kind of threw up to me and gave me the opportunity to think about. But once you pointed out, I have noticed this shift from desiring Christ in the public square from the reform circles. When Biden was president, there was a lot of push for Christ owns the public square, and we're quoting Abraham Kuyper. It's not 1 inch of where the Lord does not say mine. To butcher that quote, really, but now it seems that there's this different pursuit, maybe this different desire, this different standard, where we're sitting back and we're cooling our heels because it's like, okay, we didn't get Christ in the public square, but we got Trump, and I'm fine with that. And I've seen a lot of reform people take that attitude, like, well, we didn't get Christ, but Trump's a close second. And it just seems to be this attitude that there are still a lot of people saying, hey, this is not just. The poor are still being oppressed. The preborn are still being murdered. But, what we got when Trump became president from a lot of reform people is like, okay, man, and now it's time to work. And we're like, okay, let's keep pushing. And when you push, you seem to get this pushback. You get a pushback saying, well, hold on a second now. Hold on. We let's give it some time. And it's like, well, I thought we were supposed to be pushing, right? I thought we were supposed to get to work, right? How about we outlaw abortion? How about we end forced taxation? How about we stop oppressing the poor? How about we call for God's standards of what is just and what is unjust? And I tell you that it's like asking too much. It's like, no, we can't do that. We wouldn't get anywhere with that. Now is not the time. I hear this phrase all the time. Now is not the time. Well, I thought it was the time. That was the promise of Trump in office. Now is the time for us to push even harder. And when you're like, okay, let's push, people respond with, well, okay, we can't do that. I mean, we can't have biblical justice. And so that's why, guys like us and Lancaster Patriot, Think and Reform Podcast, the Joel Saint Show, and everyone at Future of Christendom, even Matt with Poking the Bear, we're really trying to emphasize, guys, we're not going to get anywhere with Trump in the public square. We're not going to get anywhere with Trump in the public square. We're not making any headway here. Whatever we get done with him in office can be just as easily undone, as my dad often says, with Gavin Newsom next term. Next term, guess what we're going to be talking about? The end of America. Every 4 years, we talk about the end of America. And even when you look outside at the yard signs in the lawn, vote for Trump, take America back. And nobody is calling for justice. The only role, and this is what the reform people should be understanding, the only role that the government should be fulfilling is that of justice, and it's the only thing it's not doing. We're celebrating the creation of new government departments. Yeah, I get it. Elon Musk, Doge department. Yes, it's going to be great. I believe it's going to be great. I'm glad for what we're about to see in the next 4 years. But who among us is really going to stand up and say, oh no, this government department is not going to come back and haunt us? This one's different from all the rest of the alphabet departments. This Doge department will not come. Once it's inhabited by God-hating liberals, it will definitely not come back to haunt us. An auditing department of the government is never going to come back and hurt our children. And I'm just looking at this and going, this is not going to age well. You know, now Trump is openly saying, okay, we're going to tax grants to colleges if they don't like what we're saying. I agree. You know, the liberal colleges shouldn't be teaching what they're teaching, but it's not the government's role to be telling these people what they should and should not be saying, and giving penalties and rewards. Now it just seems to be we're excited for statism in our favor. That's what it seems to be time and again when we push this. It's like, well, we have statism in our favor, so let's use it. And I just think, as I told you before, it just seems to be this boomerang that we're throwing at our enemies, but we don't realize it's going to come back and smack our children right in the face. What we're aiming for here is a standard that has a beginning and a middle and an end. Most conservatives are great in their identification of the problem, but they're horrible in their identification of the solution. When you ask them what's the solution, well, they'll say something vague like more education, and we need to strengthen the family. And we need to have better policies, and we need to get rid of the immigrants or what have you. You know, and these are these vague, mostly not unbiblical responses for what the government should be doing. And what we're saying is, okay, listen, God's law is an unchanging standard that you can see. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and an end, and you can understand what God's law says. Most Christians have resigned themselves to saying it's impossible to understand. How could we possibly know? Are we going to go with your interpretation and that interpretation? I heard one lady once at an event say, well, which version of the Bible are we going to institute? And these are questions or statements that are said from people who are ignorant of God's law. They don't know what it says, or they know part of it, and they take part of it, and then they use their statism to judge it, and then they apply it to the rest of society and say, well, this would be a terrible idea in our system. And you're right, the law is bad if it's used unlawfully, but Paul says the law is good if it is used lawfully. And what we're hoping for is to say, listen, this is not the moral majority, and this is not a movement. Lord willing, we're not trying to do a movement. We are trying to, as John Bingaman put it, he said, this is a question whose time has come. It's time. This is a question whose time has come. It's time to start asking the question of, did our forefathers give us a system that is conducive to the biblical ends of mankind? And the answer we have to say is no, they did not. And so what that means is we cannot live out or fulfill the mandates of God. And Christ says, if you love me, you will follow my commandments. And the dominion mandate, take dominion of the earth and be fruitful and multiply. We cannot fulfill those things as Christians with this system at the same time. Now, we've gotten away with a lot of previous fumes. We've been running on the fumes of the Puritans for 400 years now. But what the system that we have now, we're finding out, because I've grown up thinking that the biblical law, it has this kind of like a better version of the biblical law would be the Constitution. It just kind of improved on it a little bit. I kind of grew up thinking that. But when you look at the claims of the Constitution and the claims of Scripture, they don't jive. And the question, as John Bingaman put it, the question whose time has come, the question is this: can we have justice and the Constitution at the same time? And I think a lot of us are out here saying, no, we can't. No, we can't. We cannot do it at the same time. Historically speaking, if you look at the history of this nation, the Whiskey Rebellion, the Treason and Sedition Acts, the embargoes by Jefferson, all the way up to now, of course, everyone agrees we're in a tyrannical system now. But what we're saying is, look, we got to take a look at our founding documents and weigh them against biblical law. And unfortunately, Christians have this in their mind that they're the same, that they basically have the same thing, but we're trying to point out to people, no, they don't. And we're not going to get any further in our pursuit of liberty for this American people until we take a long, hard look and juxtapose the Constitution with biblical law. And unfortunately, the attitude of most people right now is the Constitution trumps, forgive the pun, but trumps biblical law. That's the default attitude. But I think our responsibility at Future of Christendom, and I think the responsibility of all churches, is to say there's a higher law and a superior law, an unchanging law. The Constitution is going to fade away someday. It's going to become a museum piece. And we need to be, our responsibility to the civil magistrate right now is, hey, I know it's great, Trump, you're doing all this great stuff, but that's not really your responsibility, is it? Your responsibility is to punish the evildoer and praise those who do good. You're not doing that. You're not doing that. You're owning the libs. I get it, but you're not doing that. The people are still getting, under Trump's administration, people are still going to be kicked out of their houses for not paying taxes. People are still going to be sent to prison for 30 years for owning or using drugs. People are still going to be oppressed by their own politicians and by their own police, the enforcement arm of the politicians, namely the police force, under Trump's government. And the Christians right now seem to be okay with that. And we're trying to say we shouldn't be okay with that. And just one more point on this. Yesterday, Conrad Martin, as you were there, Conrad Martin at our church gave a wonderful sermon about Haggai chapter 1 and chapter 2. And those people had just got done being punished by God for not being faithful to his commands when they were trying to build the temple. And they had just gone through famine. They had just gone through, God was cursing the work of their hands. Nothing was coming to fruition. And they said in Haggai chapter 1, God sends his message to Haggai, to Israel via Haggai. And God says to them, listen, you guys have said, because you have not been successful, now is not the time to build the house of the Lord. And let me tell you, Chris, we have heard that so many times. Now is not the time for biblical law. We can't do that now. We gotta compromise with man's law and justice so that later we can get justice. But they have a better excuse to not build God's house than we have an excuse right now to not call for justice. Anytime the state pokes its head into the Christian world, they should hear one resounding voice, thus saith the Lord, it is your responsibility to avenge those who do evil and to praise those who do good. What should I do, Christian church? Avenge those who do evil and praise those who do good. Okay, what about this policy? Does it avenge those who do evil and praise those who do good? No. Okay, then we don't want it. But right now, we are absolutely in bed with Christian statism, and we're absolutely fine with it.
Well, thank you so much, Luke. It's always good to hear your thoughts. If you want more from Luke Saint, check out his book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy, and also a brand new book coming out from Future of Christendom, co-authored by myself and Luke, and that is Redeemed by Justice, which is a concise book. I think you'll find it very helpful, especially to give to people who are new to this idea, to help them understand what the Bible says about justice and practical steps we can take to advance the kingdom of Christ here on earth. So stay tuned for more information from Future of Christendom on that short booklet. We should have it out before Christmas. So if you need a stocking stuffer, check out Redeemed by Justice. It will be available on Amazon and also at futureofchristendom.org. Well, Luke mentioned there a sermon by Conrad Martin, and I want to play a clip of that sermon because I think it's very pertinent to this topic. And Conrad is going to talk about how God will not bless a social movement that is not grounded and rooted in holiness and righteousness. So Luke's right, this needs to be more than simply a movement. This needs to be foundational to the theology of the church, to Christendom. Just as the Reformers rejected the authority of the Pope, we need to reject the authority of the legislator to make law and establish injustice. So Conrad's going to talk about the need for righteousness, the need for holiness, and to take a listen to this clip. I found this very helpful.
Now, let me apply this idea of holiness to another social movement that you're all familiar with. If President Trump is to be believed, perhaps the greatest social movement ever. Of course, I'm talking about MAGA. And MAGA promises to bring wealth, power, health, security, in a word, greatness, back to America. And yet it proposes to do this with absolutely no concern for moral reformation. So Haggai and President Trump have a fundamental disagreement about what will bring prosperity to America. And I think I'm going to go with Haggai on that one. So all that to get at the idea that a social movement can only expect to be blessed by God, to be prospered by God, to be successful if it is defined by holiness and obedience.
Well, I could not have said it better myself, and I won't try to. So if you want to listen to more from Conrad Martin, go check out that entire sermon at the Independence Reformed Bible Church's YouTube page, and you can listen to that sermon as well as many others, including the previous ones in the Haggai series from Conrad Martin. Okay, well, I want to move on to the last topic for today's episode, and that is food safety. Of course, a topic very near and dear to my heart because I just want people in America, this land flowing with milk and honey, to have the freedom to buy the food they want and serve their family and serve their neighbor. Well, this was a tweet. I guess this is Donald Trump. I mean, I don't know if it's actually him or not, but at least people respond to it as if it is, at the real Donald Trump. And this is what he said. This is several days ago now, in the middle of November. He said, "I'm thrilled to announce Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services. For too long, Americans have been crushed by the industrial food complex and drug companies who have engaged in deception, misinformation, and disinformation when it comes to public health. The safety and health of all Americans is the most important role of any administration, and HHS will play a big role in helping ensure that everybody will be protected from harmful chemicals, pollutants, pesticides, and pharmaceutical products and food additives that have contributed to the overwhelming health crisis in this country. Mr. Kennedy will restore these agencies to the traditions of gold standard scientific research and beacons of transparency to end the chronic disease epidemic and to make America great and healthy again." Now, here's the problem with this. We as a people have become so inept, so unable to govern ourselves, so undisciplined that we actually believe that we need the civil government to tell us what we can and cannot eat. The government should not be involved in this business. And this is again, I've already mentioned this on the previous podcast. One of the frustrating things is that people are making it like the Republicans and Donald Trump are going to be about food freedom, when it was Trump's appointee, the U.S. Attorney General, that went after Amos Miller in the meat case with the federal government, the USDA. So we're going to continue to have the persecution so long as the government is involved in regulating our food choices. Now, you might say, well, Chris, do you want this poison in people's food? Here's what I want. I want my neighbor, because again, we have to step back. Biblically, what should be our goal? It should be dominion, justice, righteousness. I want my neighbor to be free to take dominion. That means that he is free to use the substances that God has given us and the resources that God has given us to take dominion. I believe there is a good use for yellow 5, right? People, oh, this is horrible, these additives they put in food. And I just want to tell people, if you don't want to eat that stuff, don't buy products that have it. But don't ask the government to ban these substances and tell your neighbors what they can and cannot possess and what they can and cannot take dominion with. And this is why I don't need the government to tell me, hey, don't eat that Twinkie or that Slim Jim. If you want to eat that, fine. Of course, you have the freedom to do it. But if I think there are additives and bad products in those food products, I'm free not to buy them. Here's the problem. It's all fine and good. I think those foods should be available. People want to buy them, they can buy them. But here's the problem. Because of our statist man-made system, I am actually prevented from buying the healthy products, the natural products, the raw products from my neighbors because the government is so involved in regulating the food supply for our safety that they have created endless barriers to entry and all these regulations. And for some products, they simply outright prohibit the selling of them. So there is so much productivity, and this is what the Proverbs talks about, the fallow ground of the poor would yield much increase, but it is swept away through injustice. The problem that we have in America is that the government is creating man-made law and preventing the righteous from taking dominion and serving their neighbors. And the Amos Miller case is just one example. I mean, there are if you don't know the broken window parable and basic economics, you need to understand that, because there are so many things we don't see when you go in to manipulate the market. When the government comes in and starts regulating the food supply and creating barriers to entry, there are so many businesses and so many farmers that don't exist now that would if the government was not involved in regulating them. But they create these barriers to entries, and the big corporations love those barriers to entries entry because they can jump through those hoops. They can pay for all the fees and money and regulations, but the small guys can't. And so now we have a system where I want to have the freedom to get the food that my family needs. And what I don't need is the government to tell me what substance I can and can't get. What I need the government to do is to get out of the business of telling me what to eat. It has nothing to do with justice. It has nothing to do with bearing the sword. It is not their job. This is the problem with man-made law. And this is another problem that if we can't critique, this is just my message to those that are, really excited that we're winning, whatever that means, and that Donald Trump is in office. You still need to be able to critique any of these things, and you need to be calling, especially at the local level, but sure, at the presidential level, go ahead, for these people to follow God's law. And this is not justice. This is not righteousness, and it will come back to haunt us. As Luke said, it's not a good thing. So, someone said, well, Chris, what chemical or pollutant would you want to be free to sell? Don't you think that it's not loving your neighbor by selling them something that's harmful? And my response to that would be, listen, I don't need the state to tell me or my neighbor what is a harmful substance. That's not the state's job. Now, when we've given our responsibility over to the state, we can't function. We're incompetent, and we say, well, I can't figure out if this is healthy or not. But if a person doesn't want a substance, they shouldn't buy it. But more to the point, we are not going to be able to advance and take dominion if we as a people call on the government to control the substances and the products that we can or cannot have. Now we're saying, hey, government, your job is to take dominion for us. Your job is to tell us what to do in order to fulfill our purpose. And that is disastrous. That is not the government's job. That is placed on the individual, the family, to take dominion of the earth and advance the kingdom of Christ. And the church has a role in that. But the civil realm is to establish justice and justice only. So once the government comes in and says, well, this product's not safe, now you're going to have a bunch of regulations, and how are you going to enforce that? You still need the man-made apparatus of forced taxation, law enforcers to say, well, you can't have this substance, and this additive. And I mean, this shows us the depths that we have fallen to in the pit of statism, that we have Christians who would argue and say, well, we need the government to get these additives out of the school lunches. Abolish the school system. Why do we have a government school system? That's one of the biggest problems, because you're teaching these people to be dependent on the state. You're not teaching them to take dominion. Now, I've heard some things, and I've listened to an interview with RFK Jr. and Joel Salatin, or I think that's how you say it. I always say his name wrong, but the farmer at Polyface Farms. And he makes some points that are spot on. He says, look, the government just should not be involved in this. And I would actually be kind of excited if that's actually what they were saying. If they took his advice and said, get the government out of this. We don't need HHS. We don't need any bans on this. We need to let the righteous take dominion and set them free from these shackles of man-made law, and let them take dominion. As long as you think you need the government to control your food supply, you are not taking dominion. You are not exercising self-government, and you'll never get out of these chains of statism, basically this slavery of statism, if you and your family can't say, look, we're going to make our own choices. We're going to educate our children ourselves. We're going to make our own food choices. And if we want healthy food, and we're going to go and talk to the farmers and get it, we're going to buy the products we want. We don't want the government involved. We can make our own choices. If someone wants to sell candy or sprinkles and I want to use that to decorate my gingerbread house, so be it. Let me make the decision regarding the food that I eat. Don't hand that over to the government. So I could go on, but I just wanted to share that briefly. I hear a lot of people being excited about RFK Jr. In HHS, which obviously there are concerns with his support of abortion. And again, it seems like, well, that's not as big of an issue now that Trump's won. Let's not take the axe to the root on that. Let's just give it time. Anyway, there's much more we could say on that, but people are excited about the appointees from Donald Trump, and I understand the excitement. I get it, but we cannot lose sight of what the Bible says. We always have to go back to, thus saith the Lord. Christ is head of the church. He's head of the nation. The Pope is not. The state is not. The president is not. HHS is not. And if we can't get this, if we can't understand that whenever the civil government goes beyond what Christ has ordained for it. They're basically setting themselves up as the Pope in the civil realm, and justice and righteousness will not result from that. It won't come from that. And we deceive ourselves when we think it will. And we're leaning on the state as a crutch instead of taking dominion. And as long as we do that, we will be hampered in our task. So don't fall for it, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to have food safety, learn about your food options and choose them. Again, the reason that good food, healthy food, raw food, organic food is so expensive is because there's so many regulations. And Amos Miller is just a prime example of that. That's some of the best food I've ever tasted, the healthiest food. It's very expensive because it's very hard to do what he does. I mean, obviously, one, he's being attacked by the state because his customers don't want him to follow all these stupid regulations from pencil pushers in D.C. or Harrisburg who don't know the first thing about a healthy diet. I mean, again, do we want the government to tell us what's healthy? I mean, have we not learned by now that that's not a good idea? But because we have these regulations, it's so hard to find healthy food. When you find it, it's very expensive because the government is involved there. And it's very cheap to go buy Twinkies or donuts, and you should have the freedom to do that. Enjoy one of those every now and then. That's fine. But why is it so cheap to buy that stuff, but it's so expensive to buy the healthy stuff? Well, one of the reasons is because of the barriers to entry and the regulations and the government getting involved and switching what they're regulating. It's a trap. It's going to come back and get us. You're asking the government to choose for you what you eat. Don't do that. Just make your own choices, and we need to stop falling for these statist traps. There's so many of them, and we just get sucked in. We think, oh well, this is better than before. We can now we're not going to have all these additives in the grocery store. One, that's not going to happen. Two, that's not the solution we should be looking for. But anyway, that's it for today. We will be back soon. I will have some audience questions. I got a couple that I said I would answer. And if you would like to send in a question, email me at info@thelancasterpatriot.com, and I will try to answer your question. Again, to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/thelancasterpatriot. Thank you for all those who support the show. And I really enjoy getting feedback from you guys. So comment, share these episodes, and stay tuned. We got a lot of exciting things coming up. And I do have, again, book clubs coming up will be released soon for the patrons. So thanks for listening. Happy Thanksgiving to you. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving with your family. Enjoy the time, enjoy the food, and give thanks to God, for he is good and his steadfast love endures forever. Until next time, remember that Christ, not man, is king. So long, everyone.